So what did you decide to? Is this what your book is about?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I was. Okay.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure.
There's an email group of people who graduated with us. And you should be on it. It's me, Perky, Todd. Peter
Well, I
Howard.
get something from.
All right. He always told me if he could get any girl he wanted, it would be you. So that's when I broke up with him.
I think I went to a dance in my 8th grade
With Todd?
with his brother.
Oh, his brother was gorgeous.
Well, there were
Josh.
another kid had a couple of brothers.
No, just one, Josh.
Just one? Okay.
But anyway, he's on it, and
Maybe it was 9th grade.
Buzzy Copla's on it. Kathy has Alzheimer's.
No.
Yeah.
Wow. It's all that mass. Really.
I'm so sorry, Steve died.
That's sad.
It is. There was
Is it
a.
Alzheimer's or
I didn't
dementia?
get the details.
Buzzy said it's Alzheimer's, but
Okay.
there was a
Who told
reunion
you?
type situation for Bruce Bashford's death.
Yes, it was one of my
And
gals and
they were both there. Kathy was
Doris said such
a little bit out of it, but not totally. And then I started Buzz later, and he said she's getting Alzheimer's. I don't know if it's a second.
Okay.
But anyway, on the email, let's see who else is there. Peter Haller, Peter Bowling, who's down in Pennsylvania, teaching college down
Well, I guess he gave up on cutting the jungle back.
there. Yes, he did. Yeah. Yeah, I think he got divorced.
Okay.
So how are we doing, guys?
We ran into a weird thing that literally did not come up in any of my testing.
Of course, that's always the way, isn't it? Yeah.
So has anybody made any kind of direction towards another dimension, but they're right next to us, so be
Right.
careful what you say.
How are you doing there, Ben? This is always what happens.
So what made you get started on this?
Well, I'm going to talk about that.
Okay, we'll save it.
I will.
Well, it's pretty diverse from your first book, which is
Which
about
book?
you.
Yeah, the essay book. Yeah, I wrote a book of essays.
Oh, I didn't know.
And then I wrote a bunch of children's books.
You wrote one about how you became Christian.
That's the one that has the essays in it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm
We're good.
surprised you remember that. You're
We're good.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. Okay.
Apologies to the folks at home. We ran into some technical difficulties, but we are up and running now. So to introduce myself, I am Ben Falter. I am the Director of Education here at the Ontario County Historical Society, and I am pleased to introduce Kathleen Earle, who wrote a book titled An Early History of the Wyoming Valley, the Yankee Pennamite Wars, and Timothy Pickering, and will be presenting a presentation for us tonight called Escape to the Finger Lakes. If you are watching at home, don't forget that you can ask any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll have some time to answer those questions at the end of the presentation. And if you are at home or you are joining us live and you find value in this presentation, we would encourage you to donate to the Historical Society if you are able. We also have the very book in question for sale here at the Ontario County Historical Society, and we have autographed copies here. So if you'd like to come pick up an autographed copy, you can get one right here after the presentation. And then for those of you who are joining us here tonight, we do have information about things we have going on in the near future at the back of the room. But without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Kathleen, who is going to give us our presentation for the night.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much, Ben and Cody. Nice people. I love this society. I live in Maine, but the reason I wrote this is because I started doing research on my own family, and the situation down the Wyoming Valley, which was fascinating, and I figured it needed a book. So I had all this information, I turned it into a book. But it started with a search for John Earle, who was born in Geneva. So I just press this enter?
Yep.
John Earle was born in Geneva, New York in 1795. This is his obituary. And basically, I'll read it. He was born in Geneva. He was left fatherless at the age of 10. And from the time he was able to work until he became a man, he had the care of his mother and several young sisters. And basically, he carted goods from Albany to Ithaca. That's what he did. So I started that genealogical research in 1976. I was between husbands, and I was bored, so I started doing my genealogy. And I got back as far as John Earle. I think there's a little bit of a resemblance, right? Maybe a tiny bit. Anyway, I couldn't find anything before him. And at several points, I wrote to the Ontario County Historical Society asking them for help. And they did help me. They sent me a lot of stuff over the years. But no one could get beyond this, before this. And then I found out somewhere along the line that my great-grandfather, Charles Fremont Earle, had done a genealogy and found something he didn't like and destroyed the genealogy and added an E to the name, because my name is Earle with an E. So that made me even more intrigued. So I talked to everybody I could think of to find out where I could find out where this guy was from. And I noticed I had a pile of paper like this. I went through all the paper. A couple mentioned Pennsylvania a couple times. And then at some point, somebody mentioned Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania. There were Earls down there. So I contacted the Wyoming County Historical Society, and I said, I'm looking for the father of John Earle. Do you have any Earls down there? And they said, just the kidnappers, which really intrigued me. So I went down there. And what I found was that in 1788, 15 young men kidnapped a guy named Timothy Pickering. And I did biographies of all these guys in my book. They were all descendants of what's the first Great Migration, which was the people who came here from England between 1620 and 1640. And they were just normal people living in Connecticut and had normal lives. They weren't criminals. There was nothing wrong with them. But these guys were recruited by some men who, I'll get into the reasons before, but they were recruited by other people. And 3 of them were Earls. Benjamin, Daniel, and Solomon. And the ones that are colored here are ones that ended up in this area to escape prosecution. So these names should be around here somewhere. And I'm hoping when I do these talks that people will know some of these people, and maybe I might even be able to have a kidnapper reunion. It should be really cool. But anyway, Benjamin Earle's name is not colored because he turned state's witness and stayed in Pennsylvania. And I'm in contact with a descendant of Benjamin's, and we don't talk about the fact that he was a snitch. But anyway, okay, so it is my artwork, yes. I was originally going to illustrate this whole thing, and then I found these etchings, which are gorgeous, which are on the cover and throughout the book. But anyway, they took him to, they captured him in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and they took him to Tunkhannock, and they kept him there for 19 days. And they were very nice to him. They gave him the best food, they gave him the best bed, they carried him over the water so he wouldn't get his feet wet. And what I discovered is this was part of the Yankee-Pennamite Wars. The Yankee-Pennamite Wars started around 1760, and some people call it the First American Civil War. And what happens is the Pennsylvania people and the Connecticut Yankees were trying to kill each other for about 40 years in this war, which nobody ever heard of. And I'll get into that in a minute. But basically, he eventually convinced them to let him go. He said, you guys are never going to come and help you out. You should just let me go and I'll take care of you. So he let him go, and then he turned around and they went after him. They went after the guys. So 8 or 9 moved to upstate New York. So where did this occur? You guys probably know, but I'm showing this thing all over the place. The Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania is basically, I can't do it here, but basically the top northeast corner of Pennsylvania. And it's along the Susquehanna River. So where did they go? Where did the kidnappers go in upstate New York? The Phelps and Gorham Purchase.
Pretty close.
Very close, yeah. Geneva. I mean, Solomon Earle, Daniel Earle, John Whitcomb. John Whitcomb was the first non-native person to be married in Geneva, New York. Frederick Budd and Daniel Earle Sr., there were 2 Daniel Earles. One was a kidnapper and one was his uncle, but they both moved here. And Daniel Earle Sr. Ended up in Canandaigua, which is around Romulus. Canandaigua was the Indian name. Canandaigua, Gideon Dudley and his father Martin, Timothy Kilbourne's father Joseph, and someone named Woodward, but I'm not sure if it's the kidnapper named David. That's a pretty common name, but there's a Woodward mention in the old records. And David Whitcomb then moved from Geneva to Canandaigua. But in 1810, when the whole thing was resolved between Connecticut and Pennsylvania, he moved back to Pennsylvania. So the Phelps and Gorham Purchase, I'm sure you're all familiar with, but in case you're not, the land was bought by these people who then sold it to settlers, had it surveyed and sold to settlers. It covers about 2.5 million acres. As you can see, it goes from the lake all the way down to Pennsylvania. Happened in 1790. They actually bought it a little before that. And they paid Massachusetts for it because Massachusetts technically owned it then. And they did give the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee $5,000 for it, for title. So the Kilbournes eventually went to Canada. So they're not around anymore. But Wilkes Jenkins went to Elmira. Daniel Taylor and Zebulon Cady, we don't know what happened to them. But interestingly, some Taylor married into the Earles, and we've never been able to find who that Taylor was. But it makes sense. They kind of stayed together. They were from Tunkhannock, and I've often wondered, John Earle ended up owning Tunkhannock Falls, and I'm wondering sometimes, he had lived on the land which went down to the lake and owned the Tunkhannock Falls, but he had 6 kids and only one was a boy, so he sold it off. But I've often wondered if that's how the falls got its name, from Tunkhannock, Massachusetts. And we went there for a visit, 5 years ago? And I asked them, do you know how the falls got its name? And they didn't. So, I don't know. But anyway, lot number 12, which I hope you can see up there, right next to Geneva, is where Solomon Earle was in 1789. And I'll get into that. a little later. But why did this happen, you're wondering? How could this have happened? How did this war start? So it started because of King Charles II of Great Britain. And Oliver Cromwell overthrew Charles I, and Charles II was raised in France. But when Oliver Cromwell died, he came back and took over the throne. But he was a real neophyte. He really didn't know what he was doing, as many kings didn't. And in 1662, the governor of the Connecticut colony, John Winthrop, went to Britain and said to him, I want you to give me a deed, a secure deed to Connecticut, because I don't want somebody to take it away later. I want to make sure it's ours. And he said, sure, what do you want? He said, well, the Narragansett to the South Sea. They had no idea where the South Sea was. Well, the South Sea happened to be the Pacific Ocean. So he got a deed for all that land with a little piece carved out, because New York had already bought that or done whatever the Dutch had it. That was New Amsterdam. Then in 1681, about 20 years later, Charles II owed money to William Penn's father, Admiral Penn. And he said, how about instead of money, I give you land. And so he gave him Pennsylvania. So unbeknownst to either Connecticut or Pennsylvania, they were both given the same piece of land, which is the top part of, if you see where Pennsylvania is, the top part of Pennsylvania. That is a problem. And they both paid the Hondushoni for it, too. The Hondushoni were happy to take the money. They're very practical people. So nothing happened for almost 100 years, because the Connecticut people were happy where they were, but they had this land. But in 1753, almost 100 years later, the Susquehanna Company of Connecticut was formed specifically to move people from Connecticut over to their new land on the other side of New York. And so in 1754, they sent a team of surveyors out there, and they sold shares for $2 a share. And it was so popular, they had to raise the price to $9 a share. And a share was 600 acres. So in 1762, Connecticut settlers began to move there. And the deal with Pennsylvania, let's go into this. Who was Timothy Pickering? Well, I'll tell you a little bit about this. The deal with the Haudenosaunee, who owned all this land, who used the land, they didn't own it, was that Pennsylvania, that part of Pennsylvania, would be their hunting ground. And so when the settlers started moving there, the Haudenosaunee were upset. Pennsylvania people were upset. The Delaware, who were actually living there with the blessing of the Haudenosaunee, were upset. So, who was Timothy Pickering? So we know all the actors before we get into the action here. According to one of his biographers, he was, quote, a young man on the make who did not make it. His family was also part of the Great Migration. His ancestors came there in 1637. He went to Harvard. He didn't like Harvard, but he took chocolate with him. He went young. He went at 14. His father and his grandfather really tried to make it in the New World, and they worked very hard to be big shots. And he also became colonel of the local militia, but he was very unpopular with everyone because he had trouble getting along with people. I don't know what it was, but he challenged a local doctor. He lived in Salem, Mass. Challenged a local doctor to a duel. Left the church because of a fight with the minister. Was a Tory originally, and then when he thought it might be better to be colonial, he switched. And he joined the revolution and worked his way up very quickly, and was a bureaucrat, though. He never really fought. And he was described in this biography as arrogant and self-righteous. And he got into fights with George Washington because when he was quartermaster, he wasn't very good at providing supplies. So he got into a lot of battles. So in 1787, he convinced Washington to send him up there to fix this Yankee-Pennamite War. It was still going on. It started in the 1760s. In 1787, it was still going on, and nobody was able to settle it. And he had bought some land through Connecticut, so he wanted it settled. So he moved up there, and he was kidnapped a year later. And then he was sent to Canandaigua to be the Indian agent in 1794. And I guess you guys know all about that. And he was pretty successful as an Indian agent. And I guess the treaty that he signed is still celebrated around here from what I've heard. But he was also very paternal. He thought the Haudenosaunee couldn't take care of themselves and they needed permanent Indian agents. But Washington was so happy with that he made him Secretary of War, 1794. Interestingly, the guys who were in Canandaigua took that opportunity to move to Ontario, the kidnappers. They must have figured, if he's here, we better get out of here. So who was living in the Wyoming Valley at the time that these battles took place? The Haudenosaunee. And I'm sure most of you know this already, but there were originally 5 tribes. The Mohawk were the eastern door, the Seneca were the western door, the Council Fire was the Onondaga, and the Little Brothers were Cayuga and Oneida. The Tuscarora joined in 1722. Now the Haudenosaunee were extremely powerful. I don't think people realize how powerful they were. They had defeated or adopted all of the surrounding tribes. There were tribes called Cat People, Hurons. You've heard of the Hurons, Erie, Neutrals, and they basically just took over, subjugated everybody. He's holding a wampum belt, which is made out of shells. Are you familiar with wampum belts? Well, the wampum belts were made of shells from Long Island because they had subjugated the Long Island tribes, and that was what they gave them, in return for not killing them, I guess. I live in Maine now, and the stories in Maine are that when a Mohawk would appear on a hill overlooking a New England village, the village would clear out. They were extremely powerful. So the Wampum Belts, I'll tell you a little bit about the Wampum Belts. It was, instead of written treaties, they had belts made out of shells. This happens to be the 2-row Wampum Belt. And what it is, basically, is 2 purple rows in a white background. And each of those rows one of them represents white people, and the other one represents the Haudenosaunee. And the idea is they travel side by side through life, but they never interfere with each other. And this was actually their treaty with the Dutch in 1613, 2-row Wampum Belt. And there was a recreation of the 2-row Wampum Belt was what?
You were indicating that was used as
A treaty, yep, with the Dutch, 1613. And the treaty was celebrated in 2013 by 2 rows of boats going down the Hudson River. Does anybody know about that? My niece, who is my sister Susan's daughter, organized this. And they had a row of white people in boats and a row of Haudenosaunee in boats going down the Hudson River. And it was the 400th anniversary of the original 2-row wampum. Orrin Lyons, who's the man in the picture, is the faith keeper at the Onondaga, with the Onondaga Nation. He's 92 years old. He's still going strong.
looks good.
Yeah, he really looks good. You can look him up. He's wonderful. He's a great speaker. He's got a wonderful deep voice. He's quite a guy. The Hondushoni Chiefs, there were 50 chiefs for 5 tribes originally. And those chiefdoms were given to people by the clan mothers. It's a matrilineal and really, the whole thing is run by women. And the women would choose the chiefs and could take away the chiefdom if they wanted. And the reason they took away being a chief were mostly because they were too arrogant, too full of themselves. So Orrin Lyons is a very peaceful guy. He's a good chief. The population, everyone knows how the population was decimated. In 1650, there were 25,000 Haudenosaunee. By 1791, there were 4,500. This is where they lived. But today, there are 14,000 people living on the reservations in New York State. But there are 18,000, and a lot of them are not Haudenosaunee. But there are 18,000 enrolled Haudenosaunee. And the way enrollment works, I may be preaching to the choir here, but the way enrollment works is for the Haudenosaunee, it has to be matrilineal. So your mother, or your mother, or your mother's mother, your mother's 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 mother has to be who you're descended from through women. And there's a blood quantum, and the tribe gets to decide what your blood quantum is. So in some tribes it's a quarter. I think the Mohawk are a quarter. I think the Cayuga are half. So in order to be enrolled as a Cayuga, which means you can go around telling people you're Cayuga, you have to have a mother who's already enrolled. Consequently, the Cayuga are kind of disappearing. Because a lot of people, I worked for the National Indian Child Welfare Association in Portland, Oregon for a while, and the boss there was Seneca. And that's a very large organization, very well known across the country, but he married a white woman. So his kids couldn't enroll. So they're not considered Indian. Okay, so back to 1762, when the Pennsylvania people and the Haudenosaunee were upset about the Connecticut people moving there. The first Wyoming massacre was in October 1763. And what happened was, this was in October 1763. In April of 1763, the Delaware Village, which was in the Wyoming territory, 20 houses caught fire all at once. And Tidiaska, the chief, was immolated. And so was burned to death. So everybody blamed the Connecticut Yankees because they had just moved in. They'd been there about a year. And so everybody said, well, you got what you deserve because you shouldn't have moved here. But around the same time, Governor Hamilton of Pennsylvania sent soldiers to the Wyoming Valley to tell the Connecticut people to get out. And when he got there, supposedly, it had already been destroyed. But some people think maybe they actually destroyed it. They were supposed to go there and read the order to leave to the Connecticut people, and then arrest those who did not leave, and then burn the settlement. But in the first Wyoming massacre, which was quite violent and nasty, more violent and nasty than I think the Haudenosaunee would have done, people were roasted over fires, they had pitchforks in the eyes. It was very, very nasty stuff. And by then, the Pennamite Yankee War was just kind of heating up. So we really don't know. They blame the Delaware. The Delaware also had been Christianized by the Moravians. They had a school, they had a church. They were pretty peaceful, actually. And after this happened, they were moved out of the area for their protection. So if they did it, why would they? But, history, you really don't know. And then one of the people who had come there to clean things up, supposedly, was named Lazarus Stewart. And a couple months later, Lazarus Stewart went to the Conestoga village in Lancaster, PA, and there were only a few people in there. The Conestoga were very peaceful people. When the English moved there, the Pennsylvanians moved there. They gave them food and they helped them learn how to do everything. They were very peaceful people, and they were friends with the people in Lancaster who were white. And so Lazarus Stewart went and murdered them all. Supposedly he had it in for Indians because his whole family had been murdered by the native people. But anyway, most of the people were not there when he went there. And so the Lancaster white people took the people who were left when they came back and put them in the jail for protection. And so a couple days later, Lazarus Stewart went with all his men and broke down the jail and brought them out and hacked them to pieces. And it was so horrific, and it was similar to what had happened here, by the way. It was so horrific that Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter of protest, which is in the public record, complaining about this. Lazarus Stewart never was blamed. No one was ever blamed. They wanted to jail him. And everybody said, well, he's doing as best he could to help get rid of the hostile savages. Then there was a second Wyoming massacre. This was during the American Revolution. But before that, the Connecticut people came back in 1768, or they sent new people in 1768 from Connecticut. And they were given money for supplies and told they could have the land as long as they defended it against the Pennamites, Pennsylvania people. And in 1769, Lazarus Stewart joined the Connecticut people in return for land. So when he joined them, battles escalated. People started wearing blackface, and they were more violent. They put feathers in their hair and screamed yells and stuff. Burned farms, scattered livestock. So during the American Revolution, the Connecticut people who were in the Wyoming Valley formed the 24th Regiment of Connecticut Militia because they were Connecticut people. The Pennamites generally became Tories. They joined the British side for some reason. I don't know why. And the Connecticut people actually set up little questions with the people. They'd go around, try to convince them to join the Connecticut side, and if they wouldn't, they'd kick them out or burn their houses or whatever. But when they joined, Washington would send them to other places because they were needed all over the place, leaving only old men and young boys in the Wyoming Valley. And so John Butler, the leader of the British, found out about this, and he figured this was a great opportunity to really give a blow to the Continental Army. And so he brought 100 to 400 British and Tories and 500 to 700 Haudenosaunee. People also don't realize, I don't think, that the Haudenosaunee made a huge difference in the American Revolution, and they helped the British. And the reason they helped the British was because the British had gone out of their way to woo them and to win them over. And have you heard of Joseph Brant? I'm sure some of you have. But he was sent to a school, an English school, and he became so British that he joined the Freemasons. And there's a story about him in the Cherry Valley Massacre, which was after this one, where some guy who was about to be murdered inadvertently gave the Mason sign. And so Joseph Brant intervened and said, no, leave him alone. And then the next day, he was talking to the guy about the Masons. The guy said, I don't know what you're talking about. So he didn't know anything about the Masons. But Joseph Brant let him live. But when the guy was released, he joined the Masons. So it's an interesting story.
Well, you had to get membership.
Right, yeah. But anyway, there were only 375 men and boys in the Wyoming, against a force of about 1,000. And they were very clever. Butler was very clever in what he did. He sent a few braves, Haudenosaunee braves, out to where the Yankees were, and they would start shooting at them. They'd run away and pretend that they were being murdered and stuff. And then there was a little house called Wintermoot Fort, which belonged to a Tory named Wintermoot, and he burned that so that they'd think they were retreating. Wintermoot was not happy. He thought he was helping John Butler, let them in originally into his house and told him where everybody was and everything. And then he got his house burned so that the Yankees would think John Butler was retreating. So in this battle, the Wyoming Massacre, Lazarus Stewart played a major role again. He was a very interesting guy. He was there, and a lot of the Yankees wanted to wait until they could get reinforcements before the battle began. And he convinced them. He actually called the leader a coward. He said, "You're being a coward. We can go and get him right now. Let's go." And finally convinced them. He was friends with Denison, who was one of the leaders there. And so they marched out with a little band playing St. Patrick's Day in the morning, because Lazarus Stewart was Irish. And they had a bedraggled Stars and Stripes. But after the Indians ran back and forth and led the Americans out into a wide field, they surrounded them. And out of 375, I think almost all of them were murdered. And the Cherry Valley Massacre was the same year. And when word got back about the Wyoming Massacre, it was very nasty, very violent. A lot of very, very awful stories came out of this, which I'll get into in a minute. But the Haudenosaunee were like, hey, we weren't that bad, but then they became that bad, and in Cherry Valley Massacre, they were really horrendous and did awful stuff. But this is one of the stories came out of that. This is Queen Esther, who was a Seneca woman. Her grandmother was Kithany Montour, who had married a Frenchman. She had one daughter, Margaret, and then Margaret had two daughters, Catherine, that Catherine's town is named after, and Esther, who took over her mother's town. And there were lots of stories of atrocities, but this story was told by a survivor of the massacre, supposedly. And you can see, this is a portrait of Queen Esther, not at the battle. But the story was that she took people, you can read this, but if you can't read it, I'll read it anyway, in case you can't read it. Should I read it? Okay. At the midpoint of this rock stood Queen Esther, clad only in a loincloth. In her hand she held a huge war club shaped like a bird's beak at the outermost end, with a rock firmly embedded at the opening. Her face and bare upper body were garishly painted with fearsome-looking swirls and lines of alternating black and white. Large, dead white circles had been painted around her eyes, and the eyes themselves were like black holes in a sort of living skull. She was a terrifying apparition. For nearly an hour, Queen Esther had murmured and wailed and implored, jerking her body spastically atop the rock and reaching her hands upward in the darkness, beseeching powerful spirits to be with her, imploring them to make what was now a fitting retribution for the death of her only son, Gencho, who had been murdered on July 1st. This was July 3rd. Abruptly, she signaled toward the warriors, and several moved to the circle of captives and brought one of them to the front center of the rock and made him sit with his back against it. Now, I actually visited the rock, the supposed rock. It has one of those little state signs on it, but it's only about that high. So, I don't know, it would have been hard to put your back, you'd have to lie down, really. But anyway, that was a story which the Haudenosaunee deny vociferously, and the Haudenosaunee historians deny vociferously. But anyway, she said Gencho brought the war club down on the forehead with all her strength, crushing the skull as if it were no more than an eggshell. That's one of the stories. There were other stories. There was a story of Elijah Shoemaker, who was a Yankee, and Windecker, who was a Tory, and supposedly Elijah Shoemaker ran away into the Susquehanna River, and then he got a little way out and realized he couldn't swim. And Windecker had worked for him before this all happened. And so Windecker said, hey, Elijah, come here, I'll help you out. He put his hand out. So he brought him in, and then he took a tomahawk and hit him on the head. That's one of the stories. Another one is the story of the Pencil brothers, and their name is on the Wyoming Massacre. Or one of them, anyway. Henry, the Yankee, and John, the Tory, were both there, but on opposite sides. And supposedly, Yankee was hiding in a bush, and his brother John came by the Tory. He said, John, help me out here. And he said, you're nothing but a damned rebel. And he shot him. That's one of the stories. It was like the Civil War in a way. That's maybe why it's called the Civil War. But there are a bunch of stories like that. But there are other stories too, like the story you told me about the family that escaped. And there's a story about the Budd family. The father of one of the kidnappers, Frederick Budd, was at this battle, and he was friends with the Mohawk, Old Hendrick. And you have to realize that the Haudenosaunee were friends with a lot of these people. Nothing was black and white. And it still isn't black and white in my mind. But it wasn't black and white. They were actually Pennamite and Yankee friends. But the overall picture was of a civil war. And the overall picture was that the Haudenosaunee beat them constantly. But they really didn't. They were friends. Some of them were friends. So he was friends with a Mohawk named Old Hendrick. And Old Hendrick was at the battle, and he saw the Budds, and he said, oh, you guys, let me paint your face with red paint so nobody will hurt you. And they said, well, our two sons are coming to fight, on the Yankee side. And he said, well, take this paint and put it on their faces. And you guys he gave them a horse and said, get out of here. And they did. And that's a story that was told by Rachel Budd. So And then there are other stories. There was a woman named Elizabeth Miller whose husband was killed, and she was wandering around looking upset, and the Haudenosaunee took her home. Painted her face, painted the face of her children, put her on horses, and took her to her home in Connecticut. So that brings us to the subject of fake news. This is from someone down in Wyoming Valley in Wilkes-Barre, and these people worked with me to write this book. And I asked her at one point, what do you think? What was the true story about the Battle of Wyoming? And so she wrote this, and it's in the book. It's very hard for modern-day historians to say we know exactly what went on during or after the battle when it comes to accounts of Queen Esther or Indian savagery. The primary source accounts that survive to this day on either side cannot be looked at as undiluted by emotion of some kind. Details may have been embellished upon or left out entirely to suit the teller of the tale and to justify accusations, attacks, or retaliations. And she also said trying to get a list of the dead is another logistical nightmare, since it was weeks to months before any colonists came back to the valley, which is why all the names are not on that monument down in Wyoming Valley. To see what was left, or even bury the dead. These were summer months, so identification of the bodies was not always easy. The men, women, and children who were not killed outright during the battle fled the valley in all directions, and some of the etchings in the book show them getting away. They would go on the river, they would run through the woods. You had an ancestor who escaped 100 miles on foot, right? The men, women, and children who were not killed outright during the battle fled the valley in all directions. Even those who surrendered at the fort were made to vacate the valley on foot. Some did not survive their flight through the wilderness. So, as I mentioned, the Haudenosaunee historians disagree with this whole thing. I'm reading a book now which just came out in April. It's called Making History, The Storytellers Who Shaped the Past. It's by a guy named Richard Cohen. Has anybody seen it? I read about it in the New Yorker magazine and I ordered it immediately because it's about fake news throughout our history. And one of the things he mentions is that Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. His whole point is that how you write and what you say and how you say it is based on who you are. And Edward Gibbon happened to be a guy who was obese, 4'8", had ginger hair curled on the side of his head. His nickname was Monsieur Pomme de Terre. Yeah, cute. He suffered gout, and he had a distended scrotum that was so large it had to have the liquid taken out of it. Everybody made fun of him. He proposed to some woman, and she laughed so hard that she knocked him over. So that's got to have an effect on what he wrote and how he wrote it. I don't know exactly what it would be, but, who you are determines what you say. And this book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, as you probably know, everyone's saying is what's going to happen to the U.S. I'm thinking, well, maybe. But anyway, writing is affected by the person who wrote it. However, after the Haudenosaunee supposedly had done this horrible massacre, and after they did do a lot of damage at Cherry Valley, John Sullivan was appointed to destroy the Haudenosaunee lands. 1779, so it was a year later. And this was his route. He started down in eastern Pennsylvania, went up to Wyoming, and then up the Susquehanna River, basically, and up to the lakes to Geneva, and then across to Genesee, which was Little Beard's town. Little Beard was one of the leaders. This was directed by Congress.
Do you have a big army?
He did. He had 2,500 men.
Wow.
100 to 200 boats, 1,400 pack horses, 200 cattle. And then Major General James Clinton, was supposed to come down from Otsego Lake on the Unadilla River on barges, which he did. And they were supposed to meet down in Elmira, which they did, Chemung, I think it was called then. And when they met, they had 4,000 men. and several hundred cattle and over 1,000 horses and 9 cannon. Now, interestingly, when Sullivan went up along the Susquehanna River, they didn't go on the river, they went through the mountains, and the mountains down there are horrendous if anyone's been down there. They're sheer cliffs. They lost cows off the cliffs. Cows fell off the cliffs. Men fell off the cliffs. Boats sank. It was really, but they didn't run into a lot of resistance. In Chemung, there were a few Tories and Indians who attacked them, and I think they lost 6 men. And, but basically, the Haudenosaunee saw what was coming and fled. But there are a lot of diaries written by people on the Sullivan March. And the diaries are really interesting because, as one of the Haudenosaunee historians say, it was not a battle with people, it was a battle with vegetables. Because they spent all their time destroying the crops. That's what they did. They burned the houses and destroyed the crops. And the crops were extensive. They had huge orchards of peach and apples and all kinds of stuff. They had really great crops, and the houses were nice. Some of them had feather beds. It was not at all what you would expect. So, I mean, I also read one thing where they would go trout fishing, and then they'd come back and they'd drink rum. I mean, these guys were not suffering at all on Sullivan's March. There were a few deaths on either side. But in Horseheads, you're all familiar with the town of Horseheads? No, okay, well, it's between here and Pennsylvania, basically, a little above Chemung, right after Catherinestown, if you're familiar with Catherinestown. And the way it got its name was that when Sullivan got there, a lot of the pack horses were dead or dying, so they killed them all, and they just left them there. So somebody took the horses and cut their heads off and put them along the road, which is how the town got its name. I followed Sullivan's campaign just out of curiosity. When I got to Horseheads, there's a big wall in Horseheads that has pictures of horses on it, and I'm thinking, I wonder if they know how it got its name. They probably do. I hope they have an historical society that figured this out. And also, they repatriated adoptees. And we were talking a little bit before about adoptees. The Haudenosaunee were absolutely non-discriminatory. They didn't care if you were black, white, green, purple, whatever. And if one of their guys died in battle, they would adopt someone to replace that person. And that person became the person who had died. And so they were wonderful to their captives. And there are stories of captives, including Mary Jemison, who has a statue up in Letchworth Village, Letchworth. And they were so wonderful to the people that when the whites came and tried to bring them back, they didn't want to go. There's story after story about that. It was a good life, better life than being a frontiersman, I guess. But during Sullivan's campaign, if they found any white people, the Haudenosaunee knew that they wanted the white people back, so they left them. And one of the stories is they found a little 3-year-old boy who couldn't speak English very well, but he spoke Indian, and they picked him up and put him on their horse, dressed him, and took him somewhere. One of the things they did. Now, the U.S. president has a name from the Haudenosaunee even today, which is Town Destroyer, because of Sullivan's March. So the Yankee-Pennamite Wars continued, you know, through Sullivan's March, through the Revolution, through everything that was going on. They still were after each other, jumping out of the woods and destroying their houses, taking the women out, occasionally raping women, not often, but sometimes occasionally murdering guys. But there were some funny stories at the same time, because again, not everybody was nasty and not everybody was evil. There were people who got along okay. And this story is a really funny story. This guy, Benjamin Bidlack, and another thing that's very strange is that our younger sister, is married to a guy named Bidlack. And just for the heck of it, I traced his ancestry back, and he's related to this guy. You know?
Small world.
Small world, yes. But anyway, he was brought to the Wyoming Valley at an early age, and he fought in the Revolution. His brother died at Wyoming, James Bidlack. Oh, by the way, Lazarus Stewart died at the Battle of Wyoming, too. So that was the end of him. I meant to mention that before. Anyway, in the 1780s, he was on a commercial venture on a boat on a river, when he was captured by the Pennamites and jailed in a log cabin. And that's the log cabin. This is an etching that was done in the late 1800s, middle 1800s. And he was supposedly a splendid singer and a merry fellow. And he loved to sing and he loved to tell jokes and he was addicted to liquor. So he was amusing his jailers, having a great time. And after a while, they got quite a big crowd of Pennamites coming to see this guy every night. And so he eventually said, well, if you let me out of the cage, I'll be able to do better. So he let him out. And then he would stand outside the jailer cage and do his little song and dance. And they had to put him back in. And one day he said, I have a new song. Called The Old Swaggering Man. But it's a great song, but I got to go out on the deck, on the porch to do it because I have a cane. You got to give me a cane. And I got to be able to gesture to be able to do the song right. So they said, okay, hey, Benjamin, come on. And they brought him outside. And when he got to the line, here goes the old swaggering man. He jumped the fence. He ran, jumped over the fence. And half the guys fell over laughing, evidently. And the others were upset that he left. But he walked home 50 miles and was back in the Wyoming Valley.
Wow.
Yeah. So back to the kidnapping. So, that's Pickering's house. That was where the kidnapping took place. In Wilkes-Barre. So, he arrived in Wilkes-Barre in 1787. He was kidnapped in 1788 because he jailed John Franklin, who was the Yankee leader. And this is from his diary. He kept a journal while he was being a captive. And he says, I wrote to my wife for a camlet coat, 2 pairs worsted hose, 1 shirt, 1 pocket handkerchief, 1 towel, needle, thread yarn, leather gloves, 4 yards yellow binding, a bag of chocolate, a ½ soap, a pound sugar, 1/2 choir paper, shoes, 2 quills, penknife, Dr. Price's sermons, and a fine comb. And then a few days later he wrote, sent a large wooden spoon and butter spoon to Kilburn's to be sent thence to my wife. This was all between July 8 and 10 that he wrote these. Gave Woodward a letter dated yesterday to forward to my wife, desired her to send me a small tin kettle with a cover. Woodward returned, says my things are at Marcy's with a letter for me. So it was not a terrible kidnapping. Wasn't too bad. They were all having fun. He was, at one point, they put a chain around his leg at night, and then one of the other boys put the chain around his leg so that he couldn't get away. So that led him to be able to say he was chained at some point. And, however, on July 8th, well, he was still in the woods with the boys. There was a proclamation calling for the arrest of these guys, of the kidnappers. He was still there, so they didn't know he was being treated nicely, I guess. But anyway, they had posses and everything looking for him. And it says basically we have a public reward of $300 for John Jenkins, who was the guy who put them up to it, and one of the kidnappers. And then they mention the names of Daniel Earle, Benjamin Earle, Zebulon Cady, Wilkes Jenkins, Joseph Dudley, Gideon Dudley, David Woodward, John Whitcomb, Timothy Kilburn, and Thomas Kinney. But Thomas Kinney was actually not one of the kidnappers. He chickened out at the last minute. But anyway, so then they had posses going out looking for these guys. And they don't mention a few of the kidnappers, but I guess they just weren't sure who it was. But on July 4th, Gideon Dudley was actually wounded by a posse who was looking for the boys. And then after the kidnapping on July 29th, his brother Joseph was fatally wounded by a posse when they went after him. And Gideon is one of the guys who ended up in Canandaigua with his father. Now this is where Pickering said they were by the end, when they released him, July 15th. On July 29th, he did this list of where the boys were. And as you can see, he said a lot of them fled through the Great Swamp, including Daniel Earle and Solomon Earle. And then Ira Manville and Benedict Satterley were captured and put in jail in Easton. Benjamin Earle turned state's evidence. Joseph Dudley was the one who was wounded, and he died on July 29th. So I think Pickering actually wrote this on July 29th, but the date of the record is August 7th. And then John Whitcomb, David Woodward, John Hyde, Gideon Dudley, Timothy Kilbourne flying toward Tioga, which is on the way here. And then Wilkes Jenkins fled to the lakes, and Frederick Budd fled to the lakes. That means the Finger Lakes. So several of the elder men who supposedly helped the guys were jailed. And Joseph Earle, who was supposedly the father of Earle's, was released for lack of evidence. And also, early in the kidnapping, they had taken him to Joseph Earle's house, and a couple of the boys wanted to put him in bond, just rope on his arms, and Joseph wouldn't let them. So I think he had a soft spot for Joseph. But anyway, Benjamin Earle was caught, jailed, and turned state's evidence. But there's an interesting story about Benjamin Earle. He was evidently, and there are stories, I think there's 3 different histories, including Ontario County, that Benjamin Earle was kind of a short, fat guy, like us, right? And he had just gotten married to a woman who was very, very heavy and buxom. And the sheriff came knocking on the door, and they had a feather bed. So his wife said, "Get in the feather bed." So he got in the feather bed, sunk down in, and she lay on top of him, with face up. And the sheriff came in and said, "Where's Ben?" And she said, "You could see he's not here, Sheriff. He knows you're after him." But evidently they got him anyway. My husband loves that story. I didn't tell it. I did this presentation in Maine, and he said, "What about the story about?" So I added it.
Now, where did you find that story?
Histories, footnote of a history, one of the histories. Not sure which one, but I think it's mentioned Ontario. I'm not sure. Anyway, so September 2nd, there was an indictment, and this is really, really horrendous. It says, in the nighttime, with force and arms, viz. With guns, knives, and tomahawks, riotously, rudely, and unlawfully to disturb the peace of the Commonwealth, did assemble themselves and meet together, and so being assembled, having their faces painted and disfigured, the mansion of Timothy Pickering, then and there with force and arms, to wit, with guns, knives, tomahawks, did break and enter, and upon the said Timothy Pickering, then being with force and arms as aforesaid, an assault did make. And the said Timothy Pickering, then and there, did beat, wound, and evilly treat, and him the said Timothy Pickering, having first bound him with cords, to distant parts of the country did carry, and there cruelly and ignominiously put him in chains and kept him prisoner for 19 days, exposed to their insults and the inclemency of the weather. Meanwhile, another entry in his diary from his beginning of his kidnapping is, "A fire being quickly kindled, they began to cook some of the venison. Being hungry, I borrowed one of their knives and followed their example. I observed the hunter tending his steak with great nicety, and sprinkling a little with salt, as soon as it was done, he with a very good grace presented it to me." So there's a little bit of a problem here, difference. So they basically had an indictment of everybody, and John Jenkins, John Franklin, who was the guy in jail, and 2 other people were accused of treason. Franklin was freed March 1789, but never brought to trial. That's the guy who was in jail. The kidnappers were all convicted of riot. They were fined £7 and £9 each, and those who were captured were put in jail, Manville and Satterley. But those 2, Manville and Satterley, who were put in jail, when they got out, the Susquehanna Company gave them land. So they stayed in Pennsylvania. Benjamin Earle isn't mentioned in the indictment because he turned state's witness. So only 14 people are in the indictment. So what happened with Connecticut and Pennsylvania is that basically it went back and forth. In 1773, they said Connecticut should have the land. And this was a U.S., early young government. In 1782, the Trenton Decree ruled in favor of Pennsylvania. And it went back and forth, continuing after these guys ran away to the Finger Lakes. And around 1810, it was finally resolved when Connecticut gave up their interest in the land in return for the Western Reserve. And then the Western Reserve was bought by some guy who turned it into shares, and those were sold. So then these guys started to go back. Some of them went back. Franklin refused to pay, and they said to the Yankees, you can buy your land for just the price of the land. So some of them did. Some of them continued to shoot Pennamites and stuff. But eventually they all came around. It started in 1810. And but Franklin would never pay for his land. He was still pissed that he was captured and put in jail. Excuse me. Sorry. When he died, his children paid for the land. So now this, I was very interested, of course, in my own ancestors, and so I spent a lot more time on the Earles. And in 1789, Solomon Earle was a surveyor on Lot 12 of the Phelps-Gorham Purchase, with Yankee leaders John Jenkins and John Swift, and a few other people who were also Yankees. And some Tuscarora braves came and shot through the chinks between the logs and shot him in the chin, so that he had a big hole in his chin after that. He was taken to Geneva the next day, and the Tuscarora came back and took all the provisions out of the cabin. Mr. Baker was killed too. He was one of the people there. And so the Tuscarora were chased to Newtown, which was Elmira, where they had a trial of the people chasing them and an execution. And they executed the two guys, the two Tuscarora. And this was called the first trial in Genesee County. So one of the Tuscarora, named Turkey, who was at this battle, became well known to the settlers, was a friend of theirs after that, actually, and fought in the War of 1812 alongside them. And he actually died of smallpox. So there's stories about him. And then Solomon became a ferryman on Seneca Lake. This is the village of Kashong. Becky Chapin, who's an archivist up in Geneva, got me this, but I couldn't put it in the book because I couldn't find the copyright. It was a book written by Fred Powers, Kashong, a history, and I could not get a hold of anybody. So it's not in the book, but it basically shows south of Geneva a little bit, the Kashong area. And if you look really carefully, which you probably can't see, it says Earle, where it showed where he crossed the lake there. And that's where Earle Hill is, around there. So the story is he was a ferryman on Kashong, and somebody wrote about him. The next night we got to the foot of Seneca Lake, found there a man by the name of Earle. He had a log cabin with no floor. We stayed there all night. Earle had a scout to ferry us across the outlet of the lake. Next morning we went home with Mrs. Reed and family. Colonel Reed was there at the time, and his family went there. But Geneva was really awful in these days. It was really, just a backwater full of gambling houses and vermin. And there are stories about Geneva from then, which I read up in Geneva, but I didn't bring down here. So.
Is that because of your relative?
Yeah, that's why. Yeah. Thanks, Abby. Anyway, yeah, the Earls bring down people wherever they go. I don't know what it is. Troublemaker, I know. So that's me in near Benton, and the cemetery in Benton, next to the gravestone of Daniel Earle and his wife Dorcas and his daughter Molly Tubbs. The diary.
You said the cemetery's in Benton?
Benton, yeah, old Benton, yeah, yep. It's I think it's called the Old Benton Cemetery. If you go to Penn Yan, it's fairly near there, fairly near the Historical Society. Diary of Alexander Coventry, who was an early settler in the Phelps and Gorham Purchase in 1791, said that between the lakes, which is around where Romulus is now, he found a Daniel Earle who built a log cabin and sowed a crop of wheat. And with him was a Mr. Budd and a Mr. Tubbs, Now that Daniel, his daughter married a Tubbs, which is why I think that's the right Daniel. But Mr. Budd could have been the kidnapper, Frederick Budd, who I really have not found any proof of where he was or whether he was up there. But this suggests he was. And I went up there, Benton, New York, and I found the old Benton Cemetery, and those were the gravestones. Daniel Earle, his wife Dorcas, and Molly Tubbs, his daughter. Now, there were two Daniel Earles, as I mentioned, an uncle and the one who was the kidnapper. This was the uncle who was in Benton.
Do you know exactly where the cemetery is?
Yeah,
That,
it's up on a hill. You go out of the Historic Society and up a hill, and it's up there, very windy hill. Another Daniel Earle, probably the kidnapper and probable nephew of this Daniel Earle, is shown in the 1810 census living in Ulysses, New York, near Ithaca, Cayuga Lake, where John Earle ended up living. That's where he had the land down at Cayuga Lake. So it makes sense that that's the Daniel Earle who's the kidnapper, might be, or John Earle's father, could be. Or it could be one of his brothers, because his father supposedly died in 1805, according to his obituary. So my thought is probably our John Earle was the child of Daniel Earle's brother, and Daniel Earle ended up taking care of him. Unless the obituary was wrong. But you know how it is with history. Really crazy. So what happened to the Haudenosaunee? These are the sites of the reservations in New York State right now. They're still in basically the same area, but they're a lot smaller. And, but, you know, they're sovereign nations, as defined in the U.S. Constitution. And there are 574 sovereign Indian nations in the U.S., which is a big surprise to everybody, I'm sure. About half of those are in Alaska, and some of them only have a few people. And then I think next is California. Not sure. In Maine, there are 5, but they gave up their sovereignty in 1980 in return for land and stuff, and they're trying to get it back now. But anyway, what that means is that the state has no power on the reservation land. The federal government can take precedence, such as in some cases like murder or sexual abuse. The FBI come in, and they have tribal police, but the state doesn't have any say in what goes on. The Indian Reorganization Act in 1934 proclaimed if tribes wanted federal assistance, they had to be like the U.S. They had to write a constitution similar to our Constitution. They had to have elected leaders, not appointed by women. And they had to have a legislature. And so a lot of tribes went along with it. But the Haudenosaunee had a totally different system. Some systems already had one chief, so it's easy to, elect that chief. But the Haudenosaunee had several chiefs appointed by women. However, 3 of the Haudenosaunee, the Oneida, Seneca, and Mohawk, went along with it. The Cayuga, Onondaga, and Tuscarora did not. And I'm sure you know, the Oneida and Seneca and Mohawk all have casinos. And they're much better off than the other 3 tribes, the Cayuga, Onondaga, and Tuscarora. But within even the Oneida, Seneca, and Mohawk, there's still traditional people who do not follow this pattern. And I spent a month living with the Mohawk a few years ago, and they don't even want to do the census. They're not interested in being Americans, which is why the term Native American is sometimes not acceptable to Native people. I use Native people. The Indians themselves, when I worked with them for several years, used Indian. But I've been corrected many times by white people when I say Indian. They say, it's Native American. Okay. Whatever you think is okay. But anyway, they still follow traditional ways. They're still clan mothers. The woman I stayed with was a clan mother. And it was really great staying there. It's really interesting. They have, on the Mohawk Res, they have drag races every Friday night. And she would take me to the drag races with her little grandkids, and we'd all sit on the bleachers and watch the drag races. And it's like a very nice small town because everybody knows each other and everybody's friendly and everybody takes care of the kids. So if a kid wanders off, a neighbor will take care of it or call the mother or whatever. So I remember one time she handed $1, or one little grandkid who must have been about 5 came up and said, "No, I want a soda." And she said, "Here." And she gave him $1 and he went toddling off into the darkness with hundreds of people and smoke and dust. And then he came back with his soda. Yeah. So, here's a picture from the reservation, St. Regis, Akwesasne. Lacrosse is really big, as you know, among the Haudenosaunee. And I went to many lacrosse games, which were great because this woman's grandkids played. But basically, the people that I've met throughout the country who are native are very trusting. You know, I'm not Indian. I have a tiny bit of Indian blood way back, maybe, but it didn't matter. They accepted me. They were nice to me. They let me do whatever I wanted. And treated me like a friend. And I have a quote in my book, which I'll read to you, which is kind of the attitude of Native people nationwide, which I have found. And that is, we are born free and united brothers, each as much a great lord as the other. Well, you are all the slaves of one sole man. I am the master of my body. I dispose of myself. I do what I wish. I am the first and the last of my nation, subject only to the Great Spirit. So, consequently, children are raised with a lot of, few rules. They're kind of, if they put their hand in the fire, they'll learn not to put their hand. So, and they grow up to be very confident. So people think of Native people and they think of people saying, "Oh, poor me." Well, that's not like that at all. And I was told by the Mohawk, they said, I went to visit my friend one time who's a Mohawk, and she didn't have any water. It was me and my husband and my kid, and we walked. She said, "Oh, by the way, the water's not working." We were staying there for a couple days. I said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "Does this happen often?" She said, "Yeah. And her husband piped up. He said, "Well, white people are going to be sorry they've got all this stuff because we know how to survive. No matter what happens, we can survive without water. We can catch our own food. We can do whatever we want. And we're fine. You guys are going to kill yourselves." So I thought that was very interesting. So anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thanks for having me. I've always wanted to come here. It's been great.
How many Earls altogether are there?
Oh, very few. Very few. I had every generation only had one male, except for one generation, and I tracked down that generation, and there's only one female left in that generation. So no males. Our brother's the only Earle left of this line at all. And he's not married. So, end of the line. We're at.
Wow.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I just asked the YouTube live chat if there were any questions, so I'll give them a few seconds to ask any they might have. But one of the people in the chat, Carolyn, shared a couple of her own family connections to
Really?
these events. So she had ancestors who were involved. I believe this chat was sent during the when you were talking about the revolution, the massacre that happened during the revolution. And she had some ancestors who survived, some who did not.
Wow.
And
Cool.
the surname was Courtright.
Oh, interesting.
And then she also, the same woman, said that her collateral ancestor, Sarah Gore, married Bidlack.
Really?
Yes.
So
And
she's related to our sister's husband.
there you
Maybe.
go. And then she just corrected me in the chat. It was just generally in the Wyoming that her ancestors fought, and some died. So
So they were on the Yankee side if they were Bidlacks.
I guess so. I guess so.
Interesting. Yeah, that's great. Anyone have a question here?
Did she leave any kind of a way for Kathy to reach her and chat with her in the future?
It's a good idea. She should email me. My email, if anyone wants to email me, it's Maine Watercolors. Maine is in the state. MaineWatercolors@gmail.com. Because I'm also an artist. We all know, we can do lots of things, can't we? Abby and I started out as artists. We took the same class in high school. Instead of what? Trigonometry or something? They said, you want trigonometry or art? I'm like, trigonometry, art. We took the same class, yeah.
So I'm curious, there's a lot of research here,
Oh, yeah.
and I'm wondering where you got most of the research, if it was historical societies, libraries, even passed down through family lines.
No, it was books. Old books. And I bought a bunch of them. And, of course, old books, exaggerate sometimes one way or the other. So I tried to look for the most honest thing that I could find. But the Susquehanna Company records are the best source for all of this. There are 12 volumes, Susquehanna Company records. It's footnoted in my book. And volume 9 covers this time frame, 1787, 1788. So it has all of this stuff in it. That was my primary source. There's also a really good book by your former professor, Ben.
Oh, yes.
Paul Moyer,
Paul Moyer.
called Wild Yankees, which was written fairly recently, and it has a lot of the stuff in it. But he was basically talking about the need for land in order to make it in the U.S. And so he covered this tangentially, but the Earls are in it. A lot of these people are in it. But it was basically old books. A few articles. I've written a lot of scholarly articles that are peer reviewed, so I'm very careful to make sure I have the right source. I'm sure I've found something wrong, and if I have, let me know, because as my editor said, we'll fix it in the next edition.
I do have a question in the chat. Could you repeat the name of that book that had the records in it that you were talking about?
Oh, Susquehanna Company records.
Susquehanna Company
Yeah.
records. All right,
Let's
great.
see if I can give you the exact.
Like the river, yes.
Yes, but it's not spelled with E. It has an H on it for some reason. See, it's by Taylor. But Susquehanna Company, they were really wrote down everything. Taylor. Susquehanna Company records. And it's volume 9. I guess that's all I can say. But it's really good. It's my major source. I would recommend getting it. You can probably buy a copy. Most libraries have the Susquehanna records, but they don't have that volume. They seem to have 1 through 4 for some reason.
Now, have you done Ancestry
Yes.
for the Earls?
Yep.
So I actually just got a text message from another person saying that they wanted to tell you how delighted they were to listen to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. So, anything else, Ben?
No, nothing else coming in from the chat at this time. So I think we'll go ahead and end the stream here.
Okay.
Those of you watching at home, thank you for watching, and thank you those of you who attended, and thank you, Kathleen, for coming and giving this talk for us.
Thanks. Well, as I say, I was thrilled to come here because this is where my peeps are, right?
Right, exactly. Well, let's give Kathleen one last round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.